archivist at the Western Regional Archives, which is over in East Asheville near the VA hospital. They're actually housed in one of the old nurses' dormitories, and I was an intern there for quite a while. But Heather and her team have uncovered a lot of history about the Oteen area, the VA hospital, and she's here to share that with us tonight. So I'm gonna turn off my camera and turn it over to her. And yeah, Heather, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Sarah, and thanks everybody for joining tonight. It is a perfect night for a web program. It's rainy, nobody wanted to drive out, so now you can, be in. And there's a gas shortage, so you don't even have to leave your home to participate in a little local history. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here, and hopefully that's working out okay. I'm technically challenged, so y'all just bear with me. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Oteen, and we're going to explore a little bit tonight about Oteen, what it is, where it is, why it's important. And in my family, we call it historical spelunking. So we're going spelunking tonight, and it's really all about East Asheville. And hopefully you're going to learn something new about East Asheville and spark a little interest in hometown history. And hopefully we'll have some good discussion, and maybe we'll have some great questions at the end. But so why Oteen? Why are we interested in Oteen? And well, that's because, as Sarah said, we are located in one of the former nurses' dormitories. So the postcard you see here on the left is actually the nurses' dormitories shortly after they were built in the 1930s. So this is actually building number 9, and building 13, that's us right here. And here's a modern picture of it on the right. So we're still sort of tucked into the trees, but it's been restored, and the archives actually is the entire 3rd floor of this building. So don't tell the other people in my building, but it's the best floor. It's the best place, the Western Regional Archives, but I might be a little biased. So what's with this name Oteen? It's a very interesting and sort of complicated story. Actually, this part of North Carolina was Azalea, North Carolina, and there was a train depot and a post office, and you can find some early references to Azalea, North Carolina. But it's the hospital starts being built, and there's some confusion about whether or not the train depot or the post office was put in first and called Oteen, or whether Oteen comes from Chief Hoagland. But really, I think it's coming from Commanding Officer Hoagland. Hoagland is the first director of the VA hospital here. At that time, it's General Hospital number 19 at Azalea. And he started writing articles about the treatment of tuberculosis and other things. And as it starts to gain momentum, he starts using this word Oteen. And he said it's a Native American word for chief aim. We're not exactly sure that that's true. We can neither confirm nor deny that that is the case, but his idea was that the chief aim of Oteen was the health of the soldiers, and to return people back to their civilian life or military life in the best health possible. And so he starts all these publications, and they start going out in all of these medical journals and things like that. And basically he effectively renamed the hospital Oteen. And you start to see things come up. So there is an on-post newsletter called the Oteen, and the very first issue is in November of 1918, and it's talking about they call it the Oteen, and then they talk about the spirit of Oteen, and he elaborates and sort of writes an editorial about what the chief aim of the hospital is, and he says that it should be giving of our best for the honor and services of our country. To this end, General Hospital number 19 specifically has as its chief aim the return to the battle of life in full strength and vigor of those committed to its care. We are all soldiers in a common cause, clothed in the uniform of our government. May we honor both the cause and the uniform, and may the spirit of Oteen expressed by hearty cooperation make every day count towards success of our aim. So from the very beginning, the hospital is really gearing towards returning patients back to the best health possible. And Hoagland basically named it. And it stuck. No matter how many name changes and no matter what goes on, it's still the hospital at Oteen or the Oteen area. There's West Asheville, and then it's not East Asheville, it's Oteen, right? So it's very interesting how something so small sort of stuck. The post office becomes Oteen, and the train depot is renamed Oteen. So it all gets lumped under one name. So the completion report for the hospital is something that we didn't acquire until much after we started doing this research. It's significant because it tells us so many things. So this is, it's a beat up copy, but it's an original copy nonetheless, and it details the construction. So you have to remember that this part of the Asheville area is very rural. It's farmland and forest land, and they broke ground for the hospital in March of 1918, and they progressed very quickly because the first patient starts coming in September of that year. So the property is about 400 acres. They had over 100 buildings. So hospital number 19 is the largest and the most modern of its type east of Denver, Colorado. So you don't really think of us being or Oteen having a sort of an East Coast entirety sort of prime hospital location, but in 1918, 1919, it did. It was the premier location. And so this completion report starts detailing and starts giving us, what was being built, who was building it, labor shortages, issues dealing with the local unions and tradesmen. They talk about laying the roads. They talk about a little bit of everything. So this is really, it was so much insight, and we gained so much after we discovered and were given this as part of a collection. So in that completion report is also included this wonderful map. And I know it's really hard to see probably on your screens, but this idea is that it details every single structure, every single fire hydrant, every single pole just about on the property. And so you can kind of see here this letter A and this letter A, those two tabs go together. So the property actually extended from the current VA location all the way up past Bull Mountain Road, where the Folk Art Center is. It used to all be part of the hospital complex. Where the parkway runs through here, it was all part of the hospital complex. This whole area here is the Bull Mountain Road property. So this is actually where we're located on Riceville. These were the former nurses' barracks, and the dorms were built just right along where those barracks were. And so this is closed. It's owned by the Parkway now, but a lot of local folks use this because the roads are still there. So they use this as walking and hiking trail and paths. But you can still see some of the ruins and foundations of the buildings, but people don't really know that it was part of the hospital. You don't really know of that history. And so, I mean, it's literally you're walking over it and you don't really know what it ever was. So to me, that's kind of why I do what I do and why I love it so much. So they started out just sort of leasing the land, but once they sort of realized what was going on and how important it was, they thought, oh, maybe we should buy this land. So they actually purchased more land and made it a permanent hospital here. And what's a great little find in our collection is this this journal from Bessie Brown. The Brown family owned a lot of the acreage that the hospital was purchasing. And so we find in her diary where we sold the farm. in January of 1918. So remember, they were breaking ground for the hospital in March of 1918, and they were selling their land already to the hospital. So and that's a great little thing. And we're going to talk more about the Brown family as we go through tonight. But the Ruiz Brown family collection that's here is really special for us. We've been acquiring different collections that give us insight, but that completion report by far is the most wonderful for the beginnings of Oteen and the hospital here. So this top image that you see here is a panorama photo that is showing you what the construction is looking like. You start to see them laying in the road beds and building these barracks. The original sort of hospital structures are more temporary and more barrack style. It isn't until the late 20s and 30s that they start building more permanent structures. But also in the completion report, we saw oh, I see a question here. Did they start the hospital in 1918? The hospital was not just for influenza. It actually was started as a World War I hospital. So many soldiers were coming back after World War I injured, but it becomes a respiratory hospital because of exposure to mustard gas, into trench warfare, and also TB becomes part of that because you're in close quarters, bad respiratory conditions. And so Western North Carolina is fresh air is part of that treatment protocol, and there's no better place. And so that's why these barracks were being built here, and it becomes a city. If you think about it, it's 400 acres. It is over 100 buildings. There are roads, there are fire hydrants, there are steam pipes. All of this stuff is being put here. It becomes its own small city. It can house up to 2,000 soldiers. And so it is lots of moving parts here in 1918 when it starts. Elizabeth, no, I cannot see anyone. I can only see myself, which is very unnerving. I hope that you guys will hopefully be able to, we only can do webinar style through the state library system. So we'll open up and you can continue to put questions in the chat feature, and then we'll open up maybe, and so we can hear each other at the end. But unfortunately with the Zoom platform, we try and keep as safe as possible for people, because you have people bombing in on the conversation. So I can't see anyone. So I hope you're enjoying this. I'm just riffing off myself. I'm just a celebrity in my own mind, basically. So this picture is in the completion report from the 1918 completion report, and it shows us this powerhouse. And when we saw this photo, then it starts to have this sort of aha moment for us, that it starts to open up other pictures and other things. One great example comes from that Ruiz Brown family collection. And we had the scrapbook for several years, but it wasn't until I saw these power stacks that we start to see these power stacks behind in the background of this photo. So sometimes being an archivist and a historian means you have to use a little detective work. And it was just so remarkable to me to start to see these photos in a whole new light. And part of that is that we have our great photo detective is Rod Doty, who works, he's a library technician for the VA hospital today, and he's really into the history too. So we started actually working together on the centennial for Oteen, and we just love the history, and then we fell in love with each other, and so we now talk a lot about Oteen all the time. So we go home and talk about Oteen. I know it's a very sad situation, but we're history nerds, and so that's okay. The other photos from the Brown family scrapbook that starts to really pop out is that you can start to see maybe if my screen will advance. Here we go. You start to see with keener eyes these things in the background of these photos. So here in the top left image, you can start to see the steam lines that were running above ground because it would get too cold here in the winter. So the steam lines will run above ground. So you start to see those in the background. And then here, you see this nice family portrait and they're posing. And then if you start to look in the background, you start to see the barracks come into play. And you know, for most people, that's not necessarily something that you're going to be interested in. But remember, we're located in Oteen, so we're interested in trying to put together as complete a picture as possible. So we want to know where things were oriented, how they were oriented, what people were doing. So obviously, this shows us, this is a family scrapbook, that they're coming onto the grounds, they're taking pictures near the grounds, they were still living close by. So there's a community sort of interaction, at least with the local farmers and the local families that were here. This is sort of the most recent discovery in the scrapbooks. I tell you, you can open up a source and look at it a dozen times and still find something new every time. And this is really the only known picture of one of the original fire tower bases. You don't see much, but you can now see that this is where they are. And by using the completion report map, we can kind of even get a camera angle. So now, you know, when you're looking at a map, it kind of tells us, okay, and it looks very flat. But now that we start to see this photo, we start to see this elevation, and we can sort of, it paints a better picture of the landscape for us. And so again, unfortunately, I'm not sure which of the family members these are. They weren't labeled, but several members of the family do work at the VA hospital from the very beginning. In fact, there were people working at the VA up until the 1980s who were part of the Brown family. Mr. Ruiz, who is the donor of this collection, is 92. He's going to be 93 soon, and he kept everything, which I'm so glad for. But he worked at the VA up until the 80s, so his whole family was involved with the hospital from the very beginning, not only selling their land, but working there and being veterans. And many of the sisters married former soldiers who were here as patients, and they met them. So you'll see that that's a common theme here. It's the love connection at Oteen. This gets back to sort of Sarah's question that she posted earlier, is that it was built for the treatment of TB and respiratory issues. The first patient is here in September of 1918, and the hospital was designed specifically for these respiratory illnesses. The camp saw its fair share of influenza, but when the flu epidemic starts, they really isolate here and they quarantine, and Asheville quarantined. And I've got a different presentation that talks more about that influenza outbreak, but they also were talking about the battlefield gases, and so it scorches lungs, it burns lungs, and so there's a lot of need for fresh air and rest. And when you can't breathe, then you can't really move around very well. So you have a lot of patients who aren't ambulatory or don't get around very far. And so they're in different barracks here. So they have ambulatory wards, non-ambulatory wards, but there's definitely, I mean, you think about it in terms of you have 1,400 people here. That's just the patients. That's not the staff. So it almost doubles when you add the staff and doctors and everybody involved. And so it is this huge city happening over here in Oteen. The ultimate goal was to try and get these patient soldiers a clean bill of health and that they could be discharged. And sort of this battle of Oteen was satired in the Oteen magazine. So they, as a battle. And so it was the battle for health. And so that's something that goes on even today. It's still a battle for health. So what was it like here? Well, the wards themselves are more sort of barrack style bunkhouse lodging. The interiors varied slightly depending on which ward you were in, but the basic idea is that you have patients at intervals across. You would have ventilation, so you're going to have doors at either end. You could open, there would be porches, and then they have these sort of angled windows. And if you see the chains hanging here, if any of you have ever been to the Stable Cafe at Biltmore, it's the same principle. They're all connected so that on a pulley system and a crank system, you could open and shut the windows. So in the wintertime, you can imagine, or really just like a day like today, blankets, wool caps, robes, all of those things were a must, because even though you're being exposed to the temperature and it's good for your lungs, it's definitely going to be a challenge for your body to maintain. This is a great postcard, an early postcard that showed the ward. So they literally were laid out all across the acreage here. And they had pathways and walkways and lots of things happening, which we'll get into. So be it the ward or the porches or the grounds, all were being utilized for fresh air treatment and the protocols that had been established. And one piece of ground in particular becomes very well known, so much so that it gets its own name, and it's called Hemorrhage Hill. And this photo is great because it actually calls it Hemorrhage Hill. You can see this sort of sharp incline going on. And the goal was that after you could be transferred to the hiking ward, once you were in the hiking ward, then you would start to walk and you would practice, and you would actually be able to walk up and down this hill without hemorrhaging. So the story goes, and that was how you knew you were healthy. And so, I mean, it's kind of remarkable. And we had heard this story, but then to find this photo. And this photo comes from the Asheville VA Medical Center collection that we have. We don't have the official records of the VA hospital, but we have collected, there was a cabinet of miscellaneous things that were acquired and given to them over the years from former patients and doctors and things. And so it was just this archival cabinet. So we've taken on that collection, and this was in those papers. So it's kind of nice. This is the big water tower that's up on the hill. There's still, the water tower is still one of the few things that's up on the hill in the Bull Mountain Road property. But you can still sort of, people who walk up there talk about it being really steep. And I said, yeah, it's Hemorrhage Hill. They don't like that joke too much after I tell them that, though. All right, so moving right along, what is the big part of, it's not only sort of the treatment of the health, but also the treatment of the mind and the soul. And you have to remember that a lot of these guys weren't ambulatory. They were, or if they were, they didn't feel like going very far or doing very much. And so they end up having a lot of downtime. And so the reconstruction unit becomes a very crucial part of the care here at Oteen, and it's here from the very beginning. Reconstruction, I kept seeing that in the research and as it was coming up, and I was like, what? I didn't understand that. I've never seen that term. I'd always heard of it as Reconstruction era after the Civil War, but I'd never really heard of it in terms of, you know, a hospital. And so what Reconstruction is basically what we think of today as physical and occupational therapy. These sort of modern day fields were born out of World War I. European countries had started introducing Reconstruction as a means to sort of try and conserve their manpower because they were running out of people. And so they wanted to get them back to the front lines as much as possible. But if they couldn't do that, then they were trying to give them the best mobility and the best functionality with their injuries as possible, so they can go back to their civilian life and earn a wage and have a life. And so the U.S. saw the potential in such a program. And so by August, September of 1917, the Surgeon General had established the Division of Special Hospitals and Reconstruction, physical reconstruction for the Army. And so that's what starts here. Reconstruction aides were the women, they were civilian women who were taking on the role of teacher and educator. They weren't trained and they weren't nurses in a trained sense, and they weren't sort of therapists like today, but they were teachers and artists and craftspersons. They were teaching classes, they were teaching skill sets, leatherworking, basket weaving, all of these different things, but they weren't nurses, but they were sort of nursing adjacent, if you will. And I'm fascinated by this because I had never heard much about it. You hear a lot about World War I nursing and Red Cross nurses, and you see the photos and things like that. But you never really hear about sort of this sort of sideline. Here's a great image from the collections at UNCA. Mrs. Walter Massey was a friend of Jesse Morris, we think. And so this scrapbook, it's almost 300 images, and they're available on the UNCA Special Collections website. It's great. It's such a good inside view of what life was like here from her perspective. And so this is a great image of the typing class. Typing was just one of many things being offered here. I love this picture because obviously it's a staged photo, but it shows you that it's integrated. There's an African-American patient, there's a woman patient. So the classes were going on, and this is 1918, 1919, right? So it's kind of very remarkable. They're doing beadwork, they're painting, there are all kinds of crafts that are going on here. And that is really ties in because we have the craft guild here, and there were members of the craft guild who came and taught at the Oteen at the hospital, were teaching patients, and then several people who go on from their patient life to use their craft skills and become members of the guild. And this is a great example of that. Margaret Robinson Robert, no, not Robert. Margaret Robinson was here. She was a trained reconstruction nurse from New York, and she had gone through this training program, and she was ended up being staged and sent here. And so she was teaching metalworking, silversmithing, and some woodworking. And one of the patients is William Waldo Dodge. And William Waldo Dodge, he had been injured, had several injuries with his service, but he had a chlorine gas exposure. So that's why he ends up here at Oteen. And so he starts learning silversmithing from Margaret. He also falls in love with Margaret. And so the two marry in 1921. And in 1923, they opened the Asheville Silvercraft Shop. And so they specialized in flatware and larger sort of pieces, platters, and trophies. And so William Waldo Dodge is very well known for his silversmith skills and silver here. And he is a member of the Highland Guild, and he learned as a patient. The other person that also learns as a patient here is Stuart Nye. He comes a little bit later, so he's not learning from Margaret. I'm not sure who was teaching silversmithing at that time yet, but he was a patient here and he tried different occupations, but decided that silversmithing was the route for him. And of course, his sort of natural motifs, the dogwood blossoms, are some of the most popular and sought after pieces. And even though he's long gone, the Stuart Nye studio is still prosperous. So he also falls in love while he's here, and he marries the librarian. He marries Ruth Bell, the hospital librarian. So the Oteen romances, they just telling you, there's a whole nother book in there. I'm telling you what. So Reconstruction, we think of therapy today and occupational therapy and learning how to ride again and things like that. But honestly, and like just practical living skills, how to walk up the stairs. But Reconstruction in 1918 was everything. They were teaching reading and writing. They were teaching carpentry. They were teaching shoemaking, animal husbandry. If you've got 400 acres, you might as well teach farming, right? They were teaching drawing, rug making, law, bookkeeping, anything to give them skills. So this is way before the GI Bill. So they're giving them all kinds of skills. They were even teaching photography, gas engine theory, beekeeping. I mean, it's just sort of remarkable what all is going on here. And so I just think you know, the reconstruction, it's just sort of near and dear to me right now, because I just think it's just remarkable to think about all of these classes and things that were going on. One of the collections we have here is the Conway, William Conway Morris journal. And he was actually bedbound. And so he was not able to walk around, and he was here for 3 years. And so he wrote these journals. And so he was detailing who was coming and going, patients, nurses, who was coming to visit, which nurses were the cutest, who gave the best sponge baths, you know, important details. But, you know, you think about it, you know, today we have TV, we have our phones, we have all this sort of entertainment, and that these guys were here, that's a lot of just sort of mental time that you have nothing going on. What better way than to have this whole itinerary of things that you can do, and many of them from your bed or just from the porch, and learn and have new skills when you come out of it. So I think that, you know, Reconstruction Department is mentoring, they're teaching, and they're sort of healing in a multitude of ways, but just different than you normally would think. I do not know why my computer is not wanting to cooperate with me. Here we go. Outdoor activities. So now you have your classroom activities and sort of your indoor things, and now you have all of this stuff going on. They are staging, I mean, you would think for a hospital that's about respiratory issues that having football and baseball and tennis and basketball would be a little too much for folks, but apparently it was gangbusters. So you start to see these reports and newspaper articles of the score and of the Oteen team versus the Kenilworth Hospital, which was the Navy hospital equivalent that was in downtown. And so, I mean, the beekeeping, at one point, there's 12 apiaries on post. That's, I wouldn't think that you want bees around sick people either, but hey, you know, if you've got the ground, you might as well use it. So these are just some of the activities that are being sort of done as far as outdoor. I love that this article here calls them the farm squad, right? Yeah, so there's lots of stuff going on. Then you have activities galore. And you don't really think of East Asheville or this side of town being sort of a happening place, but it is a happening place. There are so many groups involved with staging feasts and parties and dances and productions, and they're doing operas, they're doing wrestling matches, they're doing yeah, I know, I guess it would be wrestling, I don't know, but the community involvement is huge. They're running, they would do sort of motor pools. And so you would meet up in Pack Square and you would sort of motorcade over here for an event. They were having circuses, the community involvement. They would bring flowers, they would bring Christmas trees. There were people gathering up supplies, not only locally, but from all over the state and all over the country. And that to me is just remarkable. You have American Red Cross chapters locally in the state, but everywhere sending material here. They're sending goods not only for the soldiers, and they're sending robes and caps, but they're also sending supplies. They're sending paper and books. They're sending scraps and wool so that people can use them in their craft classes. You know, it's and this is just sort of a small list of the different groups that were involved. And, you know, even today, there's still a community engagement in the hospital. But you know, it wasn't easy to get around in 1918, 1919, 1920. Heck, it's not even easy to get around today because there's no gas. But the idea is that when you think about all these people coming and going from this property, that's a heavily traveled road today, but man, it was really heavily traveled back then. So let's move forward a little bit in the history. And so the hospital starts to grow. And so by the 20s, they see that they need to build some more permanent structures. So they start to build these structures. So this is the first sort of building that starts going in. And it's then this is about 1950s. And it's now the Evergreen Apartments. that is off of Riceville Road, but it is the original admin for the hospital. And then the officers' bungalows, these are the little white houses built as you come up Riceville Road. Those were built in November of 1919. This picture is about 1941, and this comes from the Jacob family, but they start building these permanent structures, and over the years, the hospital ends up building more, but then they also start to get rid of them. So that's why this one's now evergreen. That's why the state owns this building. They just didn't need them anymore. But now they're starting to see that maybe they need them back. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the Jacobs family collection came because I was doing a talk on Oteen, and some folks shared it with them. John and Cosette Jacobs live in Florida now, but Dr. Jacobs, John's dad, Paul Jacobs, worked here. He came in 41 to scope it out, and then he was actually transferred here in 42. John is the baby you see here in the picture. And so they were here, and John met his wife here. Cosette was a nurse here. She came up from the Greenville, South Carolina nursing program, and she was here doing her rotation in 1964. And Dr. Jacobs was like, man, I think I need to set you up with my son. And so they had a blind date. And they met, they fell in love, and John went down to Greenville every weekend to see her until they got married. And then they settled here. She was a nurse, and until they retired to Florida. So they were able to send me these photos, which is great because these are those officer bungalows in the 40s. And it's just it gives life and personality, right? When you start to hear these stories. And that's part of the beauty of archives, is that it sort of makes history come to life. And I think that's why I love researching this so much, because this is literally in my backyard here. It's just a few yards from where I'm sitting. So it's a lot of fun for me. The next starts, they start building these a woman's ward, because now by the 40s, and you start to see more women patients, and so they need to add things like obstetrics and gynecology, and so they start building this women's ward, which is Ward C. So this is when it's brand new, and then now this was used until about 2017 as the Azalea nursing home facility. And so I think it was actually assisted living, and now it's vacant. We'll see what happens with that, but the rumor is that the VA has reacquired this building, and they're going to be rehabbing it, much like they did the nurses' dormitory that we'll talk about now. So in the 30s, they start, because they had sort of created all of this protocol and treatment for TB, they become known for that. Then they start bringing in nurses to train here, and they have 6-week courses, they have 12-week courses, but it becomes this huge teaching hospital, and it still is a teaching hospital, but it requires the need of dormitories. So here we start to see in 31 and 33, the nurses' dorms are built. This is building number 9 that I showed the postcard to you earlier. And this is where our building 13, will be located. These are the original barracks. I love this photo because it sort of shows the hospital in transition, right? You can start to see the construction happening, and it really is transformative. You see barracks, you see some of the permanent buildings, but you see it's in its middle stage, right? In the 40s, we add the first African-American nurses. That starts in 1942. It's not without its controversy and issue. It's an area that we have started to research into. Well, we've been researching into it, but haven't made too many inroads. But we're still hopeful that we will find more. The first original Black nurses here were from Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. The VA doesn't start to mandate African-American nurses until the 40s. And even though they had Black patients here, they were still isolated, and it doesn't really start to integrate until the 50s. But 42 is the first African-American nurses. So building 13, our dormitory, ends up being the African-American nurses dormitory. These are the names of the first African-American nurses that we've been able to uncover. There are others, and we're constantly adding to the list. But much research still needs to be done. So even though I love Oteen history, I'm running the archives, and there's lots of other things going on. This is just sort of my passion project. So I do as much Oteen research as I can on the side and in the evenings with my honey bunches. By the 50s, you have some of the same stuff going on here. You have the same kinds of craft education and reconstruction unit, but you start to have new modernized equipment. They start inventing and creating new scopes. You start to see more standardization. We have a nurses collection here, the Mary Teague Thomas papers. She comes here and is part of the surgical team in 1951. The Jacobs family, now we have Cosette's story from 1964, and they were living in building 9. Her and her nursing cohorts were in the nurses dorm next door to us. And also, I should say that in the 40s, Moore General Hospital, which was in Swannanoa, was added to the Oteen sort of hospital branch, and it ends up being basically 2 hospitals being run out of Oteen. By the 1960s, it's no longer needed to have 2 full operating hospitals. So Moore General Hospital is phased out. It becomes a juvenile evaluation center and is now the Swannanoa Women's Correctional Facility. But I mean, it was in a whole additional sort of part of Oteen history there, was that it was managing more as well. So this is the hospital sort of today. You start to see it's much more modernized. The building here is the 1967 hospital. Here you see the other older buildings still on campus and still being used. You have the emergency room, the ambulatory wing, and then you also have the CLC, which is their sort of community living center, which is like their nursing home facility. But all of the things that we talked about, besides beekeeping and some of the farm and baseball stuff, they still are doing programs like that at the hospital today. And so it's just kind of neat to see that they're still operating a century later on the same property. And the families that were living around here start to gravitate away from farming and into more businesses. So like the Brown family that I mentioned, they actually start to do, they operate the Oteen Cafe across the street from the hospital. They operate a boarding house so that people coming to visit the families or visit their patients, they could stay here. You start having the Red Cross and the hostess house. So they start to have community meetings here. So there's a lot going on. There's a small grocery store that opens up, and there's another restaurant that opens up. So it slowly evolves over the years, and but it's still, the hospital remains the central part of the Oteen community. We're always looking out and trying to share as much information as possible. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more, we've created this walking tour using Google Maps, and we've sort of pinpointed important sites around the property. The hospital is currently closed with the pandemic, but the grounds are still open. You just have to park off site, and you can walk, or you can park in our parking lot and walk some of this. We also have some points along the Bull Mountain Road property. So it's just nice to have this on your phones if you're walking around. You can also find the Facebook page, not only for the archives, but we have an Oteen Hospital, the Veterans District page that we try and share Oteen images and what we're finding. So you can search for us there if you're interested. And research is always ongoing. So if you have information or stories to share, please feel free to contact me, and I would love to talk with you more. Every new story, every new image, every new document just helps us tell a more well-rounded and a more full picture of what life was like here. From the journal entries and letters, and from, even just the simple snapshot with Hemorrhage Hill written on it reveals so much. And so, even though there are archives and libraries around. I'm a firm believer that 90% of history is still in private hands. It's in attics and basements and barns and sheds and dresser drawers and Lord knows where. We actually, right before the pandemic, were able to work with the Park Service, and we took maps and photos and tried to pinpoint where things were on Bull Mountain Road property. And so we were up. And so the photos, we were trying to circle where we saw things. There's still a few odds and ends up there that you can pinpoint. Like I said, the water tower is still there. There's one fire hydrant that we found that's still there. But yeah, so feel free to reach out anytime. And I hope that, giving you a little bit of insight into Oteen tonight. I could talk about this for days. I love it so much. I just think it's such a neat thing that this was a sort of a melting pot for soldiers from all over the world that were coming here, but also patients. The staff was coming from all over the states. You have stories of the first woman nurse is Florence Standish. She's well into her 30s. She adopts children, and here's this single woman in 1918, adopting kids. It's so outside the social norm. She ends up running her own hospital after she leaves here. So, I mean, it's just so many neat connections. And I just think that it's a small world when you start looking, even though it's history in our own backyard, there's so many connections that can be made from that. So, thank you so much for coming in tonight. Let me see if we have any questions else. Check in the chat. Someone asked if the early medical tourism was the reason the military thought our area. Yes, I think, so the question is, did the medical tourism, so early on we have things like the hot springs, we have the fresh air, and people would flee sort of the coastal areas to the mountains, get away from mosquitoes and malaria. And so he's asking if the early medical tourism was the reason for the military thought our area is healthful for respiratory problems. And that's it, exactly. And too, World War I is the first time that we start dealing with things like mustard gas and chlorine gas. And so the lungs and the respiratory issues become very much so prominent issue. And so that is something that they are focused on. And, at the time, there's not a whole lot that you can do. And so fresh air is the way to do that. And then tuberculosis, that starts to spread not only amongst the soldiers, but amongst civilian populations. So here in Western North Carolina, you have not only the VA hospitals who are treating TB, but you also have a lot of sanatoriums being created for the treatment of civilian TB. Let's see if we see any other questions. I don't see any other questions. Sarah, did you see any other? Did I miss any earlier?
Nothing else. Elizabeth did ask if this presentation will be available to watch later.
I did record this, so I can make that available. If it's saved, Lord only knows. Y'all, me and tech are not good friends. Sarah will tell you. It is, I can go to any store and be like, ma'am, we don't know why your receipt's not printing. I do, because I'm standing here. It just follows me everywhere I go. But like I said, if you have other questions, feel free to email me. If you're interested in more of the archives that we have, I'm happy to provide that. If you're interested in more of the other buildings and things that were going on here outside of the hospital, I can put you in touch with Jennifer Cathy, who's done a great program of talking about Beatles nursery and some of the other structures that were here early on. But yeah, so.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just because I love research a lot.
Yeah.
As you've been doing this whole project, has there been one really big thing you found? Did you have like an aha moment where you discovered something that you'd been looking for or didn't even know you were looking for?
Yes, I would say that so when I started this job, and what we were always told was that this building was the African American nurses' dormitory. So we went into this thinking that this dorm was built for Black nurses, 1933. But then there aren't Black nurses here. And so we know that they wouldn't build this building and just have it empty for 10 years. So what was going on? And so in some of the documents and things, we were able to find that they built this just as a nurse's dorm. So I had always, and I had been telling people, because that's what it was told to me, that this building was, you know, it's half the size of building 9, that it doesn't have fireplaces, but building 9 did. It didn't have closets, and some of the rooms in building 9 did. So that architecturally, this was built lesser than building 9 because it was for African. So here I thought it, but no, that's not the case at all. It was actually just built as a smaller dormitory. And it just later becomes the African American nurses dormitory. So that was awesome to find out. And sort of a eureka, not only for me, but for our historic preservation folks. The other thing that I think in terms of finding letters and journals, I rescue Oteen postcards and letters from eBay all the time, meaning I buy them out of my own pocket and add them to the collections. But they're just so rich with history and what's going on here. The fact that, you know, it's, I don't know, but that, to me, it's all fascinating and fun. I will probably say the most fun find just happened not too long ago at the hospital. They in the COVID era, there's a lot of downtime, and so they were cleaning out cabinets and cupboards, and in one of the cupboards in the CLC, which was not built until the 1990s, somehow a piece of original 1919 patient art had made it back to the hospital. And it's a tray. I wish I had it with me. It's a hand-painted tray that was woven, and then has a little old man picture at his mailbox with a dog on the bottom of the tray. And on the back, it has the patient's name and 1919 Oteen. So we know it's a piece of patient art. We researched him. He's missing an arm. And so he did this piece, and because we had worked on this history, and Rod was, you know, they know that he's the history nerd, they took it off of the trash pile. It was in the trash pile, and they brought it to him and says, we think this might be old and fun for you. And so then, of course, we geeked out over it. And so now it's here as part of the collection. So, you know, that's why you just never know where things are going to pop up. But how it managed to get back to the hospital 100 years later, I do not know.
This is awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Does anyone have any last questions before we wrap up? Don't see. All
That's
right.
awesome. Well, thank you all for attending. Stay warm on this cold, sort of rainy night, and may you all find gas.
And if this did in fact record on your end, and we have a link to it at some point, I can put that on the library website.
Perfect. Yep, I'll send you the link.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. Heather, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me. Talk to you soon.
All right, bye.